everybody. I am live with Dr. James McGrath, and today we're going to be talking about his book, The Burial of Jesus, History and Faith. The links and to purchase this book and everything else is in the description below. Welcome to History Valley, Dr. McGrath.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Of course.
Good to have a chance to talk to you about this.
I want to start off with, what is the difference between Paul's view of the resurrection of Christ to the Gospels?
That's a great question. Paul really has, he's our earliest person articulating his view of the resurrection, at least as far as we can tell, among the early Christian authors, those included in the New Testament. There are texts that seem to hold at least somewhat different views from Paul's, and the Gospels might be included among them. But there are also texts that are really puzzling and interesting, like the letter of James, right? And scholars disagree about whether that's a late forgery in the name of James or an early authentic Jewish Christian document. The letter to the Hebrews might want to talk about. But what Paul says that's quite distinctive is that Jesus is the first fruits of the general resurrection of the dead. And that may be implied, may be part of the worldview of some of the gospel authors, but they certainly don't come right out and say it the way that Paul does. And so on the one hand, he seems to be thinking of Jesus' resurrection in relation to the Jewish idea of two ages, right? Where you have the present age that's dominated by sin, by death, by evil forces. And then you have the age to come, which is the Messianic age, the kingdom of God. And it starts off with God raising the dead, carrying out a final judgment, holding people accountable, and then restoring paradise. And Paul views the death and resurrection of Jesus in relation to that, but in a way that requires him to rethink that view, at least somewhat, because Jesus supposedly has been raised from the dead, and yet the general resurrection that was expected has not happened yet. And so he views the moment that he's living in as part of the end of the ages, but a moment towards the end of the present age when the two ages overlap. And so Jesus' resurrection, Paul views as starting off the resurrection age, and yet the present age has not been done away with entirely. And so there's this tension between the two in this present moment. But that's a really distinctive view, and I think we have a tendency to assume that's there in the Gospels, and it may be, right? The Gospels don't always read back explicitly things that may have been part of the author's theology and worldview, but it's not said in so many words in the Gospels themselves, and certainly not in the way that Paul articulates it.
Some, usually mythicists will say that Paul did not think that Jesus was crucified, executed by human beings on earth, and they say it entirely happened in the heavens. It was cosmic. Paul's Jesus was mythical. What is your reaction to this?
I think the fact that Paul views Jesus as the first fruits of the dead, right, the first human being out of all human beings to be raised from the dead, is one of the things that discounts that. Right now, obviously, you could take just about anything that anyone has ever written on most subjects, and if you assume, even when they don't say so, that things that they mention in passing are taking place in the celestial realm, then you might be able to read that into the text, right? If you read any text from today, you view some news clip in which it talks about somebody was given lethal injection, right, or executed by giving them the electric chair, it probably won't explicitly say, and by the way, this happened on earth, right? And so when Paul mentions that Jesus was crucified, the mythicists are reading something into it that's not there. And not only is that problematic, given the overall configuration of what Paul says about Jesus and how he fits into the history of early Christianity as we know it from a variety of sources, but it's rather ironic, right? They'll complain that Paul doesn't say various things about the life of Jesus that we wouldn't expect him to say when writing to people who know about Jesus, right? He never introduces Jesus, either as a celestial figure or as an earthly figure. So clearly he assumes that his readers know the basic story already. And they complain that Paul is not saying more, and yet he's not saying more that supports the mythicist view either. And so it really is a rather puzzling view, because it might be less puzzling if the people who hold it weren't so self-assured and so convinced that they are thinking critically and skeptically about things, when in fact they seem not to have asked even some basic questions about matters like this.
And also, they seem to have difficulty explaining, I think it's in 1 Corinthians 15, that Jesus was buried, according to Paul.
Yeah, well, if you can assume that there's crucifixion, there's death, there's a cosmic sperm bank, then you're not going to have problems saying there's burial in some celestial realm as well, because apparently anything that Paul says, they're happy to transfer there. It doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter how mundane, right? Jesus took bread, in the celestial realm, or he was all present, but only spiritually, or there are so many texts that really are stretched beyond anything that would be normal to take them to mean, that it's hard to understand why anyone would do this to these texts and so distort these words. I think in some cases the people just aren't really familiar with the sources, right? They've heard them quoted, they've heard little snippets of them, they've been told that Paul got his entire gospel and everything he knew about Jesus he knew by revelation or something like that, but they've never actually looked to see, well, what does Paul actually say? And what's the whole of what he says? And how do we make sense of it? So, yeah, the burial, the Last Supper tradition, and various other things are things that are really hard to square with what mythicists claim.
Yeah, and another thing is, and I'll say that this does actually turn me off when I hear them argue, is when they don't like something, it's an interpolation, and they often they wave the interpolation card on a lot of things.
Yeah, well, it's not really a lot to add there. There certainly are interpolations in ancient texts, right? Whether Christian texts or other texts, we regularly see this. Sometimes it's a result of a scribal error. Sometimes it's a marginal note that a scribe made being mistakenly inserted, but sometimes it's deliberate, right? And in some cases, right, we could even talk about maybe Matthew or Luke interpolating as they include material from Mark, but then add something. They also edit things out and drop things. But just saying that when it's convenient, scholars have done that at times, right? So it's not as though this is something that never happens even in the scholarly realm. But if you're just doing that because it's a way of making counter evidence to your view go away, then you're not going to persuade a lot of people, right? Unless you have an otherwise very strong case. And of course, the mythicists do not.
So back, Lord of the Four Corners, thank you for your super sticker. Okay, so my next question is, you talk about the Talpia Tomb in your book, and there are some scientific papers, quite some scientific papers, as a matter of fact, saying that, the James ossuary does come from the Talpia Tomb. Apparently, they can tell from the scientific research done on it, and that the entire inscription is authentic. The entire inscription written on the James ossuary, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, is entirely authentic, written by one hand. What do you think of all this?
Yeah, so when I wrote my book, and when I've previously written things on the burial of Jesus, it's been some years now since I've continued to maintain interest in the topic. What I published on the subject was quite a few years ago. And some of those arguments were just starting to appear in print, and so aren't really taken into account in what I've written previously. But what I've said in the past is pretty much still what I'd say now, which is that if it can be demonstrated that this method that's being applied to the James ossuary and the Talpia Tomb is reliable in the way that is being claimed and does accomplish what the papers are claiming, then we should accept that, right? And it will require us to radically rethink Jesus and the early Christian movement in some important ways. But that sometimes happens, right? And that's what part of the nature of history, right? As historical investigation continues, you have to be prepared for it to not just change and challenge, but sometimes radically alter your understanding of things. Right? Sometimes we rarely find discoveries that do that, but we do from time to time. The key questions that I still have about this method are, simply the fact that, to my knowledge, and of course I don't, sort of the chemical study of archaeological artifacts in this way, but it's less clear to me that the ability to pinpoint a very, very specific location from sort of the minerals that would be present on the one hand in the soil and on the other hand in the patina that's on the ossuaries from this location. It's not clear to me that that has been shown to be the case consistently across a range of locations where there's some way to verify this, right? But I'm open to that, right? And this is one of the challenges in a field like historical study of early Christianity, is that there are questions that chemistry may be able to answer, right? And then there are things that archaeologists work on, and then there's the study of inscriptions, and that's really a different discipline than what New Testament scholars tend to be focused on, with a few exceptions, of course. And so it really does require bringing together people who, on a day-to-day basis, work on very different things, and to get them to have conversations to figure out, can we triangulate on the truth? Can we get closer to a precise answer to a historical question, or a chemical question, or an epigraphic question, or whatever it might be? And so we really probably are due sometime soon for maybe a conference, or even if it's an online conference, that brings together some of these different perspectives to revisit this question.
In the book, you note that the Gospel of Mark, in the earliest form in which we have it, does not include accounts of the risen Jesus being seen by anyone. Our earliest manuscripts of Mark end at 16:8 with the promise that Jesus will be seen in Galilee. So the question that occurs to me after reading that is, what do you make of Paul's claim that 500 people has seen the risen Christ in 1 Corinthians?
I honestly don't know what to make of it. It's a strange claim. He's the only one who makes it, and he only makes it once. And he seems to think that there are some people still around that you could talk to. But it's not clear what kind of event that's referring to. I mean, what would it mean for 500 people to see the risen Jesus? I mean, are they seeing him from a distance? I mean, are they sharing in some kind of religious experience and having a heavenly vision? I mean, we're not told about the nature of this experience. And since Paul was not one of those people that had the experience, it's the kind of thing that if it were introduced in a court of law, which of course is a different sort of situation than the study of history, although there are similarities, but if it was introduced in a court of law, we'd say it was hearsay, right? And we'd really want to hear from somebody who was one of those people. So, to be honest, I don't really know what to make of it. It's one of those things that's intriguing, fascinating, puzzling, and which people have certainly speculated about, but we're really not given enough information to say a great deal about it.
I want to shift to your earlier pages in the book when you talk about the two document hypothesis. Because lately there's a large group of scholars that are advocating the thorough hypothesis that Luke knew Matthew and Mark. Matthew knew Mark and there wasn't a Q. And the alternative to that is the Matthean posteriority hypothesis that Matthew used Luke and Mark and still no Q document. Why do most scholars conclude that Matthew and Luke did not know one another and they both independently copied Mark and Q?
Yeah, that's a great question. And on the one hand, the use of Mark, and specifically Mark, right? Not Matthew using Luke and getting Mark's material from Luke, or vice versa. But both Matthew and Luke follow Mark's order most of the time. And when one of them departs from Mark's order, the other one tends not to, right? And that suggests both of them drawing on Mark. And that's actually part of the puzzle, right? As we think about the question of whether Matthew knew Luke or Luke knew Matthew. I mean, there are certainly scenarios in which that could be the case, right? If Matthew knew Luke's material, but didn't have that gospel to hand, right? Had read it previously. Or Luke knew Matthew's material, but didn't have that gospel to hand and used it previously. Or was constrained by ancient writing practices and resources, and so had Mark, as it were, open in front of him, and could not consult Matthew or Luke, right? Whichever one it was coming along third, did not have the other one open and consult it with quite the same frequency or regularity, then that too might produce the kinds of things that we see. But there are these agreements in order, on the one hand, in the Q material, at least large swaths of it, and then Matthew seems to take that material and organize it into larger discourses, right? Those sort of 5 groups of teaching material. And it's hard to imagine Luke coming along and finding those nicely organized segments of teaching and scattering them in quite the way that he does, right? It's not just that they are broken up and scattered, because one might do that, right? But there doesn't seem to be any kind of rationale that one can deduce. And scholars tend to not simply assume that ancient authors were completely incomprehensible and did strange things for reasons we can't understand, right? We look for motives for why they do the things that they do. And so it's the combination of agreement and yet disagreement, both in terms of how this material that they share in common is used and how it's presented, right? The Beatitudes are found in both Matthew and Luke, but very different forms of them. And on the other hand, there are these differences that are puzzling if one knew the other, right? If Matthew knew Luke's infancy story, why would Matthew rewrite it in quite the way that he does? If Luke knew Matthew's infancy story, why would he rewrite it in quite the way that he does, right? The infancy stories simply don't fit together historically, right? Luke has the family of Jesus be from Nazareth. Matthew has them be from Bethlehem. And Matthew has to explain how they end up in Nazareth. And Luke explains how they end up briefly in Bethlehem. And the two stories involve really quite opposite geographic movements, as well as very different geographic movements in different time frames. And it's not clear, right? I mean, anyone can rewrite anything, and so you can just say, well, I rewrote it. But unless we can come up with some explanation for why an author would have rewritten it in that way, then there's going to be another alternative that deserves attention, which is that maybe they both have this material in common because each got it separately from a separate source, right? When Matthew and Luke do things with Mark, usually we can figure out why they're doing what they're doing. Even if it's just a question of improving on his wording, right, or something like that. So those are the key reasons for that view. But you're right that there's increasing consideration of alternatives, and that's a good thing, right? Because ultimately, even though I'm still someone who leans in the direction of something like Q, the truth is that there's oral tradition, right? There's memory, there's other things, possible other documents. And so no one simple explanation of the relationship between the Gospels is going to do justice to every single instance. And that's part of why this continues to be a a matter of debate with no clear resolution in sight.
How would you respond to Q critics that would say it's a fairly hypothetical document? There's no external references in church father material or anywhere, no manuscript, nothing.
Yeah, well, what we have, right, are early references. Some of our earliest references are not clearly to the Gospels that we have in the forms that we have them. And so we have Justin mentioning the Memoirs of the Apostles, right? Could be these, but could include other things. By the time we get to Luke, Luke says that many have written on this subject. And even if that's Mark, Matthew, and John, that still doesn't seem like many, right? And of course, authors do engage in hyperbole, they exaggerate, but the possibility that that indicates awareness of other writing, could be implicit there. And then there are references to things like, Matthew having originally been in a Semitic language, and then there was a translation involved and things like that. Awareness of other Gospels, some of which seem to postdate and be working with these Gospels. But the Gospel of the Hebrews or the Nazarenes or of the Ebionites, right? It's not always clear whether these are reference to 2 different or 3 different texts. There's some indication in our early sources that there was more out there than these Gospels. And of course, we found the Gospel of Peter, right, which we have some early references to. There's the Gospel of Thomas, which others were aware of. And Mark was neglected for a long time, although it wasn't discarded, and it did continue to get mentioned. But it wasn't given a terrible lot of attention because most of what was in it was in Matthew and Luke, and Matthew and Luke had so much more as well. And so once most or all of Q ends up in Matthew and Luke, that might explain what happened, right? We don't have, other than in Paul's letters to the Corinthians, we don't have references to his other letters to the Corinthians, but he does indicate that he had written to them previously. So we have little hints that there's more writing going on in early Christianity than the texts that we have. But we don't have a clear reference to something that very clearly corresponds to the Q document, or even closely seems to line up with what scholars are supposing Matthew and Luke indicate by way of deductive inference from them.
What do you make of Paul quoting Jesus a couple of times in, I think it's in 1 Corinthians, and it's got Jesus at the Last Supper apparently being betrayed by an unnamed person, presumably Judas, and he makes a couple of statements that are similar to what's in the Gospels about the Eucharist. Eat my flesh, it's bread. Drink my blood, it's wine.
Yeah, so that it's interesting that there are several places in, particularly in 1 Corinthians, where we have indication of Paul's knowledge of the Jesus tradition. And so we have the Last Supper, Lord's Supper connection that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 11. But we also have, when he's addressing the issue of divorce, he says that on the one hand, a Christian should not initiate a divorce. And he says, not I, but the Lord says this, right? Indicating that we have in Jesus' teaching something on this subject. And of course, from the Gospels, we know that Jesus indicated that this prohibition of divorce. And then when it comes to a question of, okay, but what if the other spouse who's not a Christian initiates a divorce, then what's the situation? And he addresses that and says, I and not the Lord. And so indicates that he's aware that this is, and he's making sure they understand this is his own judgment on the subject. As for the account of the Last Supper, right, there are interesting similarities to Luke more than to Matthew and Mark, although all 3 of the synoptics largely agree on this. And it's striking to have this so early. Right? It's a historically minded, skeptical scholar can't have, or likely won't have Jesus saying a great deal about his death, resurrection, or things like that in advance. On the other hand, speaking historically, if your mentor, right, thinking of John the Baptist, if your mentor was executed by authorities, then it's entirely possible to envisage Jesus seeing that the writing was on the wall and that he might meet a similar fate. But it's not clear what these words that are spoken are supposed to mean, right? And when we take into account some of the other early Christian sources, which have very different accounts of either the Last Supper or of the Lord's Supper, then other possibilities start to come into view. So on the one hand, the Gospel of John, it has earlier in the Gospel, in John 6, has reference to eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood. But by the end of that, Jesus says, the flesh counts for nothing, right? It's the spirit that gives life, and that his words have a spiritual meaning, right? Every time Jesus says things that seem unacceptable in the Gospel, there's indication that it's to be taken spiritually rather than literally. But then when we get to the final meal with the disciples, there is talk about the vine, but it's about unity, right? I am the vine, you are the branches, things of that sort. And of course, Paul focuses on unity as one of the main significances of this meal. When we read the Didache, right, it doesn't talk about the bread representing Jesus' body, but talks about the wheat, right, being gathered from many fields to become one loaf. So the church sort of is gathered together. And so my own hunch is that Jesus may have had a meal practice that emphasized unity, right, as he was bringing people together across divisions and forming this movement that involved attempts to reconcile people who were at odds with one another. And then he may have used the language of body and blood in reference to community. And it may be that in the process that looking back from the perspective of Jesus' death, that a final meal that Jesus had and some of the words that he said at that might have been viewed with hindsight as having a deeper significance or a different significance. And there has to have been some transformation as this was adapted from a story about a meal that Jesus had with his closest followers to a practice that was going to become part of regular observance and celebration as Christian communities met together.
What do you make of claims like the Ascension of Isaiah? Memphis is like bringing up the Ascension of Isaiah, and some of them think it's a pre-Pauline text, and it clearly shows that Jesus died in the heavens.
Yeah, so I mean the Ascension of Isaiah is a text that certainly deserves more attention. The assumption, and that's really all it is, that this is a pre-Pauline text. The case for that has not been made in a way that persuades scholars who work on that text, who are admittedly a fairly small group. But this is a text that seems to be, first of all, composite, right? So it's not one text that was written by one author in a unified way. And then it involves Jesus descending down to the, as it talks about the sort of sublunar realm, right? And that's the realm that we find ourselves in, right? So sort of the moon is you've got the lowest of the heavens, right? And there does seem to be some room in the Ascension of Isaiah for sort of a firmament or something that is essentially a dome that is beneath the lowest of the standard celestial spheres, right? But having a sevenfold or an eightfold celestial realm of spheres, those different configurations are not unheard of even from other sources. But the realm beneath the moon, it extends everywhere down to the underworld, right? And that's the realm that Jesus enters. And exactly where certain things unfold within that framework is less clear. But one of the things that has to be said is that some of what sounds like it might at least be open to a mythicist interpretation may be a result, and does seem to be a result of some of that editing process, right? As you get people with slightly different views contributing to this composite text, so that two different things that two different authors said when they sit side by side in this work can be read by people coming up with a viewpoint several thousand years later, or at least more than 1,000 years later. It can be read in ways that don't seem to necessarily be what the author implies, and some of what they find in there is more what they're reading into it and assuming about it than what it explicitly says. But the Ascension of Isaiah is nonetheless a fascinating text, in as much as it gives us a pretty unique glimpse of something that is taken for granted in other works, right? That there are these celestial spheres, and that there's a different level of glory, right, as one gets closer and closer to the divine realm that is far above them. And whether we're reading texts from Jewish mysticism, whether we're reading texts from Gnosticism, whether we're reading early Christian texts, the transformation that happens as a figure journeys into the celestial realm is a consistent part of it. Right? And so ultimately, right, one thing that's clearly there in the Ascension of Isaiah that's not clearly there in Paul is that the figure that gets exalted to the highest heavens by the end of it, say, in Philippians 2, started out there. Right? In Philippians 2, we get the sense that Jesus is being highly exalted, hyper exalted, right, super exalted, to a level that he did not occupy previously. But it's when you get that combined with other texts like the Gospel of John, and the early Christians are further reflecting on these things and wrestling with them and trying to reconcile them, that you get this view that the one who is exalted to the right hand of God, that's appropriate for him because that's a return to a place, a position he eternally occupied. And I see that happening, that sort of idea coming into play already in the prologue of John's Gospel, where I think there's this sort of inverted parallelism, where in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, explains how it can be appropriate that this figure of the Word become flesh, namely Jesus, could be exalted to the right hand of God, to the, as the idiom puts it, the bosom of the Father, right, seated alongside the Father.
But John's view, could the Gospel of John's view of the pre-existence of Jesus have been derived from Paul's belief in the pre-existence of Jesus in this letter to the Philippians?
It's possible. There are a couple of things, right? Colossians, it's not clear whether to bring that in, because we should bring that in because there are debates about whether it is an authentic Pauline letter. It's one of the ones that there's more debate about than some of the others, right? The pastoral epistles, almost everybody agrees that they're not by Paul. Ephesians, there's a lot of agreement. Colossians, less so, right? And so it's hard to know. But whether Paul took any of that pre-existence language literally is an important question, right? He doesn't say that Jesus reveals heavenly things the way John says those things, right? John has Jesus walking around. Of course, John is writing a narrative, but he has Jesus walking around saying, what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? And either the narrator or Jesus himself says, no one has gone up into heaven except the one who came down from heaven, the Son of Man. And some manuscripts, it's the Son of Man who is in heaven. And so it's not clear that Paul is thinking in those terms, but if he did think of Jesus as pre-existent, or, was it Jesus as the pre-existent Messiah? Because that's a category, that's an idea we get in Judaism. And not necessarily the same thing as being, the Word of God, who is then made flesh. Did he think of Jesus as, he certainly thought of Jesus as the wisdom of God, and so embodying God's wisdom. But you have in Jewish literature places where there's a very poetic, elaborate description of God's wisdom, and then we'll be told, this is nothing other than the book of the law of the Lord of the Most High, or something like that. And so it may be that the Gospel of John is starting to turn into prose what others had said as poetry, and is starting to take literally what others had affirmed as this this idea, right, that the Messiah, God must have the Messiah prepared, right? He must be there in God's mind, and what's in God's mind is much more real. Maybe he's prepared in heaven, but they still expected him to be born like other human beings. And it's precisely the challenge of saying some of the things that John says and some of the things that the Synoptic Gospels say, which don't have that view of Jesus' preexistence and the incarnation and so on, that leads to the later developments and debates about who Jesus is and how to think about him.
How much of those sayings of Jesus in Q do you think Jesus actually said?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I've never actually tried to calculate the percentage. I think there was a genuine desire of early Christians to remember what Jesus said. I have no doubt that they invented things and adapted things, and that even when they tried to remember precisely, there was no such thing as a recording device. And even if Jesus repeated himself, it wouldn't have been the exact same words every single time, right? And so how much of that is the exact words, I don't know, but I think that the early Christians were trying to preserve them. And the fact that we have some that don't fit the aims of the early Christian movement points in that direction, right? So I'm right at the start of, I'm trying to finish off a couple of projects, and then I'm going to be diving full on into a year-long focus on writing about the figure of John the Baptist as a historical figure. And in Q, we have this fascinating focus on John the Baptist, right? He's really prominent. And some of the things that Jesus says about John are striking and don't seem like the sorts of things that Christians would have invented, right? Among those born of women, there's none greater than John the Baptist, right? Well, Jesus is among those born of women, and he's saying that John is the greatest human being who ever lived. And that's what you would expect Jesus, as perhaps he's coming into his own, maybe even hoping to take over the reins of John's movement after John is imprisoned, would say about the person whose movement he understands himself to be a part of. And trying to emphasize that Jesus is greater than John would invent. And so things like that indicate that we have traditional material that's likely authentic. I wouldn't even try. I have not spent enough time sifting through Q and doing calculations to feel like I could put a percentage on it. Sorry.
All good. How do scholars analyze a historical Jesus, as in what methodology do they use? Also, if you a little side question to that is, how does that show the flawed analysis in mythicism?
Well, because Jesus has gotten the attention that he has, the thing that often gets forgotten, or I don't think it's forgotten, I think it's ignored or downplayed by mythicists, is that Jesus has been treated with much greater degrees of skepticism by historical scholars, right? From the time of the Enlightenment, you have the development of historical critical methods, but they probably weren't applied as skeptically to anyone with as much attention to detail and as much doubt and willingness to discard things as in the case of Jesus. And that's why you have historical Jesus scholars not just drawing on some of the main points that all historians make, such as the one that I was making about that saying about John the Baptist. If there's no reason why the community that preserved this would have invented it, then it's probably traditional and goes back earlier than them. They probably inherited it. That doesn't prove that it was never invented by anyone. But once you're getting back to really early sources, if you say that this author hasn't invented it, then that's strong testimony towards the likelihood of historicity. When it comes to other figures, historians don't go through and haven't really gone through sort of saying by saying with a fine-tooth comb in trying to apply some of what historical Jesus scholars have called criteria of authenticity or things of that sort. And those really were developed based on some principles that are used in wider historical study, but really trying to, on the one hand, be as skeptical as possible of the Jesus tradition, because there was such a concern, and there still is the potential for people to simply assume that Jesus said things because of a faith commitment or something like that. But on the other hand, there was these scholars who had developed these principles were looking for anything that could serve as a justification for deciding that some things perhaps were authentic, right? And so historical study in general and the historical investigation of Jesus as a historical figure have really shifted in another direction of late. And there's a lot more focus on what we can understand from the psychology of memory, for instance, how memory works, understanding how oral tradition and oral transmission of information works. And what both of these, both the study of oral tradition and the study of memory, indicate is that it's rarely precise words that are going to be remembered, unless they were words that are crucial to like a saying or a joke, right? The punchline of jokes often gets recited verbatim when the rest of the joke, not very few of the exact same words were used. The point of a story, right? A key word that helps make that point, a pun or something like that. And so historical scholars are realizing that really what we need to be looking for is the gist of the tradition. And that, I think, is helping to shift things back towards what has always really been the consensus, but I think is becoming even more so, which is that Jesus was an apocalyptic figure, right? Which is the impression we get overall, all across the early tradition, right? John the Baptist seems to be this kind of figure. He's talking about the kingdom of God, the axe is at the root of the tree, there's a judgment of fire coming. And then after Jesus, you have Paul as our earliest source saying that the judgment is coming, right? The end is nearer now than it was before. And talking about we who are alive, right, meeting Christ, right? So Paul assumes that he's going to be one of those people who's still alive when the present age wraps up and the age to come fully dawns. And so the gist of the tradition and the trajectory of the tradition indicates that Jesus was this kind of figure. But we saw during the latter half of the 20th century were attempts to take individual pieces, right? And because there was no glue to hold those two pieces together in any one particular way, people were playing with other possible configurations. And of course, individual sayings can be arranged in lots of different ways, can be construed in lots of different ways. And so there's much more of a focus on the gist of the historical figure and a recognition that we can't get back past people's memories, and people's memories are never perfect. And we need to just accept that and embrace that. And that's no more true and no less true of Jesus than of other figures.
What do you make of the claim that John 21 is the lost ending of Mark?
Yeah, so I'm of the view that the story in John 21 preserves at least the gist, or some of the elements that were in the lost ending of Mark. The ending of Mark in our earliest manuscripts just doesn't seem plausible as an ending. It certainly isn't the ending of the story that the author knew, right? The author knows of Jesus being seen in Galilee, right? Or at least expect people to see him in Galilee. And the ending is just too abrupt, right? They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid, and yet here you are reading about something that they supposedly never told anyone, right? It's self-contradictory. It's not an open ending, as people sometimes claim. If you stick that ending on the end of the Gospel of Matthew, right? Jesus says to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel, right? Making disciples of all nations, and lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. But they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. You're not thinking, oh, well, this is an open-ended invitation for me to do what they didn't do. You'd be like, what is this? This story makes no sense, right? This is a weird ending. And so I think that Mark's ending was lost at some point. And one indication of this is the fact that Matthew and Luke diverge dramatically right at that point at which Mark ends. So probably, was lost very early. And it could be that Mark never managed to finish a manuscript he was working on, but the story that he was telling was not done, right? And that, I think, is the key point, rather than saying we can prove that the original was damaged, or the earliest copy was damaged, or something like that. And so if we ask, what happens if the disciples flee and women go to the tomb, find that the body is missing? I'm not sure the tomb was empty, because in Mark's gospel it seems to have been a burial place for those executed on that site, right? Jesus is given a dishonorable burial. And so they don't find Jesus' body where it's supposed to be, but that's not necessarily the same as an empty tomb, right? And so I want to avoid using that phrase for Mark's gospel. But if the women don't pass on the message and the disciples flee afraid, then what happens next? And a logical answer is that they flee to Galilee and go back to their old lives, and there encounter Jesus, right? Have these experiences, whatever these experiences were, that are described in the early Christian sources as seeing Jesus, right? Whether it's, whether one wants to say they're dreams, visions, hallucinations, or say that they are actually tangible encounters with an actual person. In some of the texts, this person doesn't look like Jesus, and yet they're persuaded that he is. And it's, there are really odd aspects to it. But the story in John 21 gives us a hint of that, right? The disciples are fishing, right? And this seems like a first encounter with the risen Christ. And some of the details also seem like they would fit nicely at the end of John, or at the end of Mark. And yet this is definitely a story that's created to fit the end of John. And so it's an adaptation, at least, of the story that was found there. The Gospel of Peter also ends abruptly, right? And there we know that the manuscript is damaged. But there too, it seems to have started telling a story like the one we get in John 21. The disciples, right? The women say nothing to anyone. The disciples have gone back to Galilee. They go fishing, and presumably they're going to see Jesus there. And so I think we have reason to think that the empty tomb tradition and the seeing tradition probably came together, didn't come together immediately, because one of these things was happening in Jerusalem, people not finding Jesus' body, and yet not necessarily having any visions of him. And on the other hand, people having visions, but not having stories of an empty tomb. And so it may be that it's the coming together of those two, whether early in the process or late, that really does shape what becomes the Christian view of Jesus' resurrection.
What do you think caused the early Christians to think that Jesus rose from the dead?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that I don't think a historian can answer with with a high degree of confidence. But it can be asked as a historical question, right? People come to hold certain beliefs, and religious beliefs are things that people hold, right? And we can ask, why did people come to believe that, Muhammad went on, his famous night journey, or that, UFOs would whisk them off in the tail of a comet, or any number of other things that people have believed or continue to believe. And asked as a historical question, I think that experiences of seeing someone that they believed was Jesus must be part of it, right? And how many of those things are things that we would categorize as dreams is harder to say, right? Because ancient people did not have modern psychology. They did not think of dreams in the way that we think of dreams, as the products of the subconscious. They pretty consistently view dreams as things like, divine revelations, as glimpses of otherworldly realities, as things like that. And so if they had dreams in which Jesus encountered them, then that could contribute to this. I suspect, though, that probably would not have been enough for something like Paul's belief that the final resurrection was coming about. And so I wonder whether Jesus did not, in fact, predict that the kingdom, right? He talks about the kingdom coming. He says that this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. He talks about, right, the Son of Man, and whether that's himself or another figure. Right? There have been debates about what exactly he meant. But whoever is going to wrap up the present age is going to come before this generation is gone. And he also does seem to see that he needs to suffer, right? Whether he thinks he's going to die, right? There certainly doesn't seem to be the idea of an atoning death in his mind, right? He's asking for the cup to pass from him. But those very words, right? The fact that in Gethsemane he seems to be distraught, and yet from this vantage point on the Mount of Olives, where you can see people approaching, you can flee if you're inclined to, he embraces this as what has to happen. One possibility is that Jesus expected that he would be apprehended, that he would be mistreated. Whether he thought that he would die or be rescued before it actually happened, it's hard to say. But he probably expected that God would intervene, whether before he died or immediately after, to raise the dead, not just himself, but all of the dead, bring about the kingdom of God, and vindicate him. Right? If he genuinely believed that he was the Messiah, then he may have believed this. And the early Christians may have had that as something that they had believed was true. And if they had dreams and experiences that convinced them that God had vindicated Jesus beyond death, even if not in the way that Jesus had spoken about and they had expected, that could have led to early Christian belief in the resurrection in the form in which we find it in the New Testament documents. Can I say with great confidence that that's exactly what happened? No. Am I being too skeptical and not leaving room for divine action and things like that and miraculous revelation? Well, as a historian, as a person using historical tools, you cannot bring miracles into the picture, right? And from a historian's perspective, I think that what I've outlined there is something that plausibly fits the evidence, that doesn't either simply dismiss it and say they're making things up, which they seem to genuinely believe the things that they're talking about, right? And people seem to have genuinely had experiences, and people continue to have religious experiences, and so there's no reason for a historian to say that those couldn't have happened. I think what I've outlined at least makes sense of the events. Be interested to know what you think of it. I'm certainly interested to hear whether in the super chat or in comments on YouTube or wherever they show up. Interested to hear what other people think of that way of reconstructing what might have happened.
Here's my final question for today. Do you think that the Son of Man and Jesus were originally distinct? Since in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is the Son of Man, but in other times he's not, especially in Mark 13.
So, Son of Man simply means human being, right? And so it's a vague expression. One of the things I'll be exploring in this book project that I've got for this coming year is whether when John the Baptist spoke about one who is to come, right? Someone is going to come after him, and he's got the winnowing fork, and the threshing floor is going to sift the wheat and the chaff and so on and so forth. But is this someone or one who is coming, right? Would John, speaking in Aramaic, have used the expression Son of Man? And was Jesus in his Son of Man sayings continuing that? That might explain how some of John's followers may have thought that John was talking about himself, and others thought, no, he's really talking about someone else who's coming. And then as Jesus continued this way of speaking, Jesus' followers may have said, okay, so now we think he's talking about himself. And others may have said, well, maybe there's someone else coming after him. There are a number of possibilities, right? Dale Allison has this interesting suggestion that the Son of Man is this sort of already existing celestial doppelganger of the Messiah. And so the two will sort of become one, but are not yet sort of fully fused. It's the sort of heavenly paralleling the earthly and yet being connected to it. But I think that, at least initially, what we get is John the Baptist expecting that and talking about someone who's coming, and whether that's the Davidic Messiah, maybe alongside his Aaronic priestly Messiah, whether that's none other than God himself. That's a lot harder to pin down. I think that may have been intentional because the authorities will clamp down much more quickly on someone who's saying, I am going to do this and I am going to be that, than talking about, when the Son of Man comes, right? When that figure that you're waiting for comes, here's what's going to happen, right? And so that third person way of talking, we get it on the lips of Jesus. The earliest encounters we have of it in the Gospels, the authors are thinking that this is Jesus. It's hard to get back past that to exactly what Jesus thought, and whether indeed his thinking on the subject changed at all over the course of his life.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dr. McGrath. I thank everybody that supported me in the super chat and everybody else that participated in the live chat, and I'll see all of you later. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.